Well, good morning, everyone. I feel like it's been a while. Today's lesson 11.6 vertical shifting of sinusoidal graphs. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to vertically, so up and down, shift our graphs of sine and cosine. That's basically it. They just made it fancy in sinusoidal graphs. Anyway, all right, so there's a couple of things. In our last lesson, we focused in on that A value. And remember, that gave us our amplitude, how high, how low. So we're going to work with that again, but we're going to introduce this C value. Okay, so let's do a little background information and just chat about what these values are. So what's kind of cool about sine and cosine is that the rules are the same. Basically, just their starting point when you graph them is at a different point, but otherwise they're technically the same graph, just a shift away. All right, anyway, the A value, this value here, the amplitude, it's a vertical dilation. Okay, and what it does is it changes the min value, the max value, and the range. Okay, so your highest point, your lowest point, and the range is how high to how low. All right, now the A value, there should really be absolute value signs around it, because once you do that, you can call it the amplitude. Because remember, the amplitude you learned about has to always be positive. The A value can be negative, but amplitude is positive, so that's where the absolute value comes in. Now, there's a couple of other things I want you to remember about the A value. The A value is the distance from the midline. We'll talk about the midline in a second. Okay, so if you were going to symmetrically draw a line in the middle, a horizontal line through the curve, that's your midline. Okay, now there's also a little formula. I'm going to mention it now, but it's not going to come back for a while. It's how to find it if you have a graph rather than a formula or an equation, and it's the max minus the min all over 2. So for right now, that's not going to be a big thing, but it will down the road. Let me make sure. Oh, we're a little out of range, so I'm just going to move over a teeny bit. That should be better. Okay, C value, real important. The C value also will change the same as the A value. So it will change your minimum. It will change your maximum. And again, it will change the range. All right, the C value, that's your midline. So that's going to be where you graph your amplitude off of. And you'll see as we progress. There's a formula for the C value. Again, if you're given the graph and not the equation, your C value is the max plus the min all over 2. So there's a lot of cool applications. You'll see this unit with the graphing. Last week, 11.5, that was the intro to the graphing. So it goes all the way to, with graphing, till about 11.8, where we'll do some real life examples. That's when your calculator is going to come in. So 100% do not try to use your calculator here. The settings are, they're a little bit crazier, and you don't get those definite points to label your graph. So you might get the general shape of the graph, but you wouldn't know how to put it on a piece of graph paper. So follow my lead here, all right? And there's a couple ways I'm going to explain shifts. There's 2 ways to really graph. I'm just going to explain both to you, and then, you have to do what makes sense for you. All right, so looking at example 1. Example 1, that graph in black, that's just the original sine curve. Okay, the one that we graphed in the last lesson. So what we have now in example 1 is sine of x, right, the original, but plus 3. Now remember, anything outside away from the x value is always going to be up and down, go with the sign. So according to our old rules, we know that this should get shifted up 3 units. So what you want to write here in letter A is that we would shift up 3 units. And that's because our C value is a positive 3. Okay? Now, what we want to do next is, on B, we want to graph sine of x plus 3. So what I'm going to tell you is every point on this graph is shifted up 3 units. So you could technically just go to each point and count up 3. So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And I have all the dots, so I could technically connect it, but there's another way of thinking about it. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to graph this with another way. So just kind of ignore those points for a sec. I just want it to all fall in place. What you could do is you could, well, what we just did, you can either take every point and shift up 3 units. That's fine, but you know what? You actually have to have that original curve graphed in order to shift it up. So if that curve wasn't there, this really isn't probably the most efficient way to do it. So the best way I think to do it is to first graph your midline. So remember, the midline is the C value. Your C is a positive 3. So if you go up to positive 3 and put a horizontal line, that's going to be where you count your amplitude off of. So I'm on this green midline, right? Ignore those points and ignore my dog. All right, so off of this, right, we know we have a sine curve. So you could start here at 0. Remember, sine goes like that. So sine would go up, back to the 0, min 0. Now your amplitude is only a 1 here, so you're counting up 1, 0, down 1, 0. And then you could do it the other way with the pattern, right? If you were up here, you're going to be down, up to the midline, up to the max, down to the midline. So look what happens. I mean, all those points that we graphed in the beginning did fall on our curve because there was 2 approaches to it. When you don't have the original, I would do it like I did in green, graph the midline and count the amplitude. If I have the graph and I just have to shift it up 3 units, then maybe just counting up 3 vertically is not a bad idea as well. So that's up to you. We're going to move on to the next one. But before we move on, the way this lesson is supposed to fall is on Tuesday, May 26th. And yesterday, May 25th, we had 2 very important 16 birthday for 2 people, for Eric and for Isabel. So before I forget and before Rosie barks her head off, I wanted to wish you both a very happy birthday. Hope you enjoyed your day. I hope we got a good Memorial Day break. I'm hoping that the Monday's weather holds up because I'd like to do something socially safe, I guess, you know, with possibly my family with masks on. We'll say I'm a little bit of a chicken. Don't want to get my mom sick. All right, anyway, example 2. All right, now we're going to change it up a little bit. Example 2, when you turn the page, we have 2 cos x plus 1. So we need to sketch that graph. Let's kind of talk about our approach here. Our approach here, we have that 2 cos x graph. So now it's going to be a little bit higher and lower than the sine graph before that we graphed because that had an amplitude of 1. This has an amplitude of 2. My original is not graphed there. So I'm going to take the approach where I graph the midline first and then count off. What's nice about these graphs is that my x-axis is already labeled. We haven't talked about how that spacing goes yet. We will in the next lesson. So just go for it. Anytime you have something labeled here, we're going to switch where we are on the curve. So a couple of things. We can have an idea of what's going to happen with our maxes and our mins. Now, if you look at just 2 cos x, right, this part here. All right, just want to make sure I'm in a good spot. Okay. The amplitude tells me it's 2. So technically my min would be -2 and my max would be +2. However, this here plus 1 now takes those mins and maxes and adds 1 to it. It brings it up. So now I'm going to add 1 to the min. That's going to give me -1. And I'm going to add 1 to the max, and that's going to give me 3. So if I graph this correctly, my low point should be a -1, and my high point should be a 3. Okay, so we're going to graph the midline. Okay, so they say give the equation of the horizontal line that the curve rises and falls 2 units above. All right, so let's attempt this graph. We're going to use our midline, which is the C value, and we're going to drag a horizontal line at 1. And that's what we're going to count our amplitude off of. Remember, a positive cosine curve starts high, goes to the min, and then goes back up high. So when you're at 0, it's going to start up high. So your max is 3, but it's only 2 off of the midline. So 1, 2 off the midline. And remember with cosine, it goes to the midline or goes to the 0, which happens to be this line here. And then it's going to drop to its minimum. Remember, the minimum is 2 below this line. 1, 2. And then it's going to go back up to this midline and back up to the maximum, which is 2 above. Now that I have this side, I'm going to go backwards. I know that I'm going to hit my midline. I'm going to hit my minimum, my midline, and my maximum. And now I have my curve. So try to make a curve. It's a little tricky. All right, so we've got the cos curve. Now, we said it should have a max at 3, a min at -1. So my max, 1, 2, 3, is at 3. My minimum is at -1, so that makes sense. The equation of the horizontal line. All right, all horizontal lines are y equals lines because they cut the y-axis. So y equals, we actually already sketched this line. The line is y equals 1. Now, the range and interval notation. You have set builder notation, you have interval notation. Interval notation is the brackets and the parentheses. So this does hit -1 and 3. So you are going to have a bracket. My low is -1, comma, my high is 3. And I do hit 3, so I have brackets. Okay? All right, so where does the Regents take this? Like, you're lucky you're not taking the Regents. Who knows, next year, maybe people watching this video, if they are, might have to take a Regents. But what they like to do is they like to mix and match curves. So a sine curve on the graph and a cosine on the same graph. So couple of things. In example 3, we have a sine curve. If you look, the amplitude is going to be 4. So without my shift, I should hit 4, -4. But now I'm going to drop my curve down by 2. So it's going to get shifted down. With my cos curve, this is interesting. I have a -2 a value. My amplitude is still 2. But instead of starting, if you look up here, cos, regular cos started at the max. When you have a negative sign, you're just going to start at the min. And it's going to take this, negative cos curve, and it's going to shift it up 3 units. Okay, so let's kind of, before we put the graph on, and this is the most important thing, you got to have kind of a rough estimate of what your graph is going to look like. So for this top one, I'm just going to draw a picture. I'm going to draw it right here of what my curve should probably look like after I graph it. It's going to be a sine curve. It's a positive sine curve. We're going to see 1 cycle to the left of 0, 1 cycle to the right. So when all is said and done, I should have 1, 2. That's what my sine curve is going to look like. Now my cos curve, I'll change the color. Let me change it to green. Now that's a negative cos curve, so it's going to start at the min. Again, we're going to see 2 cycles of it. So it's going to go up like this and down and then again. Okay? So those are my 2 curves. We'll see if they intersect. Sometimes they ask questions about that, but let's attack the sine curve first. So I'm going to go in purple. Let's talk about our min, max, like where we should be. All right, so originally with this 4, our min should be -4, our max should be 4. If we drop it down 2, we subtract 2 from each value. So it's going to go as low as -6 now and as high as +2. Your midline is -2. Okay, so we're going to have a midline of -2. So at -2, just kind of put a dashed line for now. Let's try that out. Remember, that's what we count the amplitude off of. If we do it correctly, these values will make sense. All right, so let's start at the 0 where we normally would be, but now we're shifted down to our midline. All right, it's a sine curve, it's positive. So I'm starting here. I'm gonna count up by my A value. So my A value is 4. So at this point here, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'm gonna go back down to my midline. 1, 2, 3, 4 down here. And then back up 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I was 0, max, 0, min, 0. All right, so if I was at the max and at 0, my next logical point would be a minimum, which is 4 down, 2, 3, 4. Back up to my midline, back up to my max, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back down to my midline. So remember, I said I would go up and down, one cycle, up and down and back to the midline. So let's see if that works out. Oops. Oh, geez, Louise. This should go here. Silly Mrs. Thornton, what were you thinking? You were probably like, what is she doing? So that's not there. I got a little excited. All right, so this graph here, we really should label it y equals 4 sine x minus 2. Just so we have a good graph. I can't believe I made that mistake. Oh, boy. All right. Anyway, let's do the next graph, which is y equals negative 2 cos x plus 3. Remember, it's going to kind of look like the m's or an m. Let's see, our midline is 3. So we're going to go all the way up to 3. So let me, let's see. All right, let me, I'll just stick with the purple here. Let's do our min, our max, and let's set this up. All right, a negative 2, A value. The amplitude's 2, but my min's going to be negative 2 and positive 2 until I factor in this 3. So I'm going to add 3 to both. It means that I should have a 1 as my min and a 5 as my max. All right, so let's see, my midline is 3. So I'm going to swing my midline at 3. So at 1, 2, 3, I'm going to put my dashed line. And this one here, I will graph in pink. All right, so I'm counting off of my midline by 2 units, 2 up, 2 down. It's a negative cos curve. So at the 0, when y is 0, and when x is 0, let me say that again. When x is 0, okay, we're going to start at our midline, okay? And it's a negative cos curve, which means I'm going to start at the minimum down here. So that means I'm going to count down by 2. Okay, and then at this here, I'm back up to my midline, and then I'm going to go up to my max, down to my midline, and then down to my minimum. Okay. This way here, I'm going to go up to my midline. I'm going to count 2 to my max, back down to my midline, and then back down to my minimum. So they are going to kind of hug each other a little bit, but they shouldn't cross. And that is your y equals negative 2 cos x plus 3. So again, I apologize for that little mistake. Those graphs do not cross, so there's nowhere that they're equal. At some point when we use the calculator, you could always type in the graphs and see if they hit. What the regents would sometimes do in the past is maybe hit for certain values that they intersect, or sometimes they ask how many values do they intersect. That's something that's really going to come up in pre-calc. So good luck next year. You might have me, you might not. All right, so anyway, let's see what else we have in store for us. We have one more page. Okay, now these are easy. We're not graphing, so right? Take a load off. All right, we're just going to figure out an example for the range. Okay, now if you look at A, B, and C, not only do they have A values, which they should have, but they have those C values in there. So it's kind of like what we did over here when we figured out what was going on. So what I would suggest you do is write, let me make sure I'm in good view. All right, I would write a couple of things. I would write the min and the max. And then we're going to put our values at the very end in interval notation. All right, so if I look at letter A, I have 7 sine x plus 4. 7 is my A value. The amplitude is going to be the absolute value, which is 7, which means my minimum is -7 and my maximum is +7. Now you factor in the C value. So it's +4, which means you add 4 to both values, which tells me my minimum is -3, my maximum is 11. Okay, so popping that into interval notation, it is going to hit both those values. So you definitely have brackets. So you put the low number, -3, the high number, 11, and a bracket here. So if you want steps, figure out the max and the min from the A value. Add the C value. And that's how you get it. So let's take a look. Letter B. Now our A value is negative. That's fine. That just affects the starting spot. The amplitude is still the absolute value of -5, which is 5. Tells us our min, -5. Our max, +5. That's without this shift. But when you take into account the shift of 2, we're going to add 2 here, add 2 here. My new minimum is going to be -3. My new maximum is 7. It does hit them both, -3, 7. All right, this one is a big one, right? We have a min and max value in C. Wow, A value of 25. This is more like a real life problem. That you'll see down the road. My min would be -25. My max would be +25. I add my shift in, which happens to be 35. It gives me a new minimum of 10 and a new maximum of 60. Okay. So now our interval notation, low value of 10, high value of 60, brackets on both. Just for giggles, if they asked for set builder notation, that would be your inequalities. So you would have something like this would be 10 is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to 60, because we're talking about height, so it's the y value. Just in case you happen to see multiple choice and it's not in this setup, but it's in that setup. All right? Okay, so last problem for the day. Woohoo! Example 5. All right, example 5, now they give us a graph. So this goes back into, where's my first page? Right here. Remember, I said if you had the graph to find your values of A and C, you might want to use these two formulas. All right, so we're going to revisit that. All right, we have a graph. It looks like a sine curve, and actually, yes, it is, because that's the format. We got to figure out our A value and our C value. This is where we're leading to in the grand finale. I'm going to give you values like this on a graph, and you're going to figure out what the equation is. Pretty cool. So we need two things. We need A, and we need C. Okay, so remember your A value. Okay, your A value had the formula max minus the min over 2. So your A values and C values only deal with the height. So the X values here don't come into play, just the Y values. So your maximum, this goes as high as 22. Take away your low value of 6 over 2. That's 16, right? 22 minus 6 is 16 divided by 2, which is 8. All right, your C value, same formula, except instead of subtracting, you're going to add. So max plus the min over 2 22 plus 6 over 2, that's 28 over 2. 28 over 2 is 14. All right, so now we have our A value, we have our C value, our equation. They actually just asked for the values of A and C, but we're going to pop it into an equation anyway. It's y equals your A value of 8, sine of x, plus your C value of 14. So that's the equation here. Pretty cool, right? So this midline right here, that's going to be y equals 14. And if you think about it, you would go up 8, right? 14 plus 8 is 22. 14 minus 8 is 6. So it should all fall in place. So again, no calculator needed here. Just use your brains. All right, so that's the scoop. I hope you all have a great day. Happy birthday, Eric and Isabel. That's about it. Do some of the homework problems, and I will post the key as well.